Now we want to move on to talk about the last topic for today's lecture, which is about interest rate. Interest rate is the general concept for return. So for interest rate, we say that the interest rate can be defined into two types. One is called the nominal interest rate, which is the interest rate listed at the bank. When you go to the bank, you say, what should be the interest rate? That is the interest rate that you will see in our daily life. But in economics, when we are talking about the returns, we are more interested in the real interest rate, which is the interest rate that is considering the changes in the price. Because when we go to the bank, it gives us an interest rate of 2%. But if the inflation rate is more than 2%, then the actual return we are going to get is not equaling 2%. Because when we take the $100 to the bank, and then we have an interest rate of 2%, it means that, for example, after a year, we are going to get $102. For that $102, that we are supposed to be able to buy more things than $100. But this $102 is the dollar amount that we are going to get 1 year later. So if there is an inflation rate, for example, 2%, then when you get $100 today, you go to the store, you can buy a bottle of milk. Then you say, hey, I want to save the money in the bank and then get the milk 1 year later. Then you can put the money in the bank, get a 2% interest rate. And then for that 2% interest rate, you are going to get $102 a year after. But then if the inflation rate is more than 2%, for example, 5%, then which means that when you go to the store to buy a milk, last year it cost you $100, but this year it's going to cost you $105. So then after you go to the bank to withdraw the money that give you 2% return, that's $102. You no longer can buy a bottle of milk. That is the concept of real return. That is, you want to get the number of the goods. But if the nominal interest rate gives you 2%, but the inflation rate is 5%, then you no longer can get more goods after you put the money in the bank. So then the return is negative in this case. So in economics, we care quite a lot about the concept of the real interest rate. So then when we are computing the real interest rate, we need to take into account the inflation rate, as I mentioned earlier. But inflation rate can be two inflation rates. One is before it is realized, and the other is after it is realized. Therefore, we have the expected inflation rate and the realized inflation rate. So one I denoted as pi e, which is for the expected inflation rate, and the pi is the realized inflation rate. So then when we come up with the real interest rate, we are going to have two types of the real interest rate. That is because the definition of the real interest rate is the nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate. Given that there are two types of inflation rate, so then there are two types of the real interest rate. So the first type of the real interest rate is called the ex ante real interest rate, which means that we want to figure out the real interest rate before the inflation rate truly occurred, or the change in the price truly occurred. Then we define the real interest rate ex ante equal to I minus the pi e, which is that we adopt the expected inflation rate and plug into the formula for computing the real interest rate. We are going to get the ex ante real interest rate. We can also have the ex post real interest rate, which is defined as the I minus pi, which is the nominal interest rate minus the realized inflation rate. So then if the expected inflation rate and the realized inflation rate are different, then the ex ante and ex post real interest rate will be different. And then when people are making decisions about whether or not they want to invest in certain type of the asset, when they are thinking about the returns, they are thinking about the real interest rate before the inflation rate is realized. Therefore, the interest rate that we use for making the investment decision is the ex ante real interest rate. And the actual return that we are going to get for our investment or for holding an asset is the exposed real interest rate. So this is the discussion I want to have related to interest rate. And this is the end for today's lecture.